Alright, so today we're going to talk about the language of pathology. And this is our third lecture in our series in immunology. And this here is a particular part of immunology known as a vector. Alright, so what's the point? By the end of this, you should be able to define the following terms: pathogen, vector, transmission, microorganism, and parasite. You basically want to identify all of these terms in context of a particular disease, and we're going to focus on malaria, and that'll be the very end of our lecture. Okay, so living things. An organism is a living thing. A microorganism is also known as a microbe, and can't be seen with the naked eye, so we can only see it with a microscope. Or if we look at viruses, such as this one here, we can only see it with the electron microscope. Generally unicellular, few exceptions, and those exceptions are often animals. Like this here is a microscopic animal, and it has multiple cells. Bacteria, fungi, protozoa, algae, viruses, sort of, and few plants and animals. The reason we say sort of for viruses is they're not alive. Alright, so they can be seen with the naked eye when they exist as colonies, and you'll see this when you have bread, okay? Mold is a fungus, and it doesn't exist. You can't see it on its own. A single cell, you can't see its own. But when your bread's moldy, by the time you can see it, you're looking at millions or billions of fungal cells. Okay, so pathogens. What does pathogen mean? Pathogens are agents or basically anything that can cause disease. So not all microorganisms are pathogens. Many are helpful. This down here, that's not so helpful. Nor is this one. Alright, some are even necessary for our biological function. So a microorganism is only a pathogen or pathogenic or an agent. No, hang on a sec. No, that word and that word in this context. They're only those when they are causing a disease. Alright, so vector, transmission, host. Alright, so an organism that carries a pathogen and transmits it to the host. That's what a vector is. Here is a mosquito. That plane on the first slide, that was a plane called a mosquito. This is a mosquito, which is a vector for lots of bloodborne diseases. And this is Mary Mallon, also known as Typhoid Mary. And she basically cooked for a lot of snooty rich people and killed them all by giving them typhoid, which was a pretty brutal disease in the very early 1900s. Now, we call her a vector because she was what we call asymptomatic. She never had a symptom, not once. She never got sick, and she basically served people a lot of raw food without ever washing her hands, and killed a few or a lot of people with typhoid. Okay, so the vector is not affected by it. That's really important. This gives us Typhoid Mary down here, and she lived to be quite old. She was actually quarantined for a very long, for most of her life. Once the police eventually caught up with her. Basically, transmission is when we pass the pathogen from one organism to another. All right. There's direct transmission, which is when we pass it to one another. So if we through contact, basically. So if I sneeze, even if I sneeze at you, and I've got a bit of a cold right now, so if I sneeze at you, you might catch my cold, even though I've not actually touched you. That's direct transmission. Whereas if mosquito bit me because I have malaria, and then it bit you, that's indirect transmission. So indirect transmission has a vector. Direct transmission is person to person. Yeah. Okay. So the host, that's you when you're sick. If you are affected by an agent or a pathogen, you are a host. Mary Mallon was not a host. She was a vector. She was never once affected by it. You'll see her written down a lot as saying she was a host of typhoid, but she was not really, because she never was affected by it. Alright, so a parasite. Now, parasites, that's anything that uses an organism. Let's just say an organism, because we use agent to mean something different. So an organism for food or shelter. So you can have microparasites. These are things like toxoplasmosis, which is the one we'll show you in a second, um, or macroparasites. So at one stage during its life cycle, if you can see it with the naked eye, that's a macroparasite. If it's tiny, tiny, tiny forever, um, that's a microparasite. All right. So, yeah, well, where's my eraser? Get rid of that. Get out of there. All right. So this is Toxoplasmosa gondii, and as you'll see, it's a protozoan. Looks like an animal cell, but it's not quite. And this is its life cycle. This is really cool, actually. It kind of turns the rats into daredevils. Okay, so basically, the cat eats an infected mouse, or mouse, rat, whatever, eats an infected mouse. Okay, so it eats it. This little cyst here that's got a ton of eggs. It goes down. It reproduces and forms oocysts, which are the eggs, and so they comes out and it gets pooed out. So then the mouse comes along. It's messing around in the cat poo because the mice, they're dirty, and it chows down on a little bit, and it becomes a secondary host. Now, it can pass it on to babies, but that's not really the point of this. So it starts off as an acute infection, and it then becomes a longer a longer host. It becomes chronic, and this is because it starts to spread and creates these well, we'll just call them cysts. Okay, so little growths that are full of them inside its digestive tract. Now, then it gets eaten. So the mouse gets eaten by a rat. I wonder if you knew that happened. The mouse gets eaten by a rat, and then the rat gets eaten by the cat, and it starts all over again. What's really cool is that they've found that toxoplasma or toxoplasmosis affects the brain of this animal and this animal and this animal and this animal and causes daredevil behavior. So normally where this this mouse would, say, just walk around the edge of the room, it'll cause them to run across the center of the room. So they lose their sense of inhibition, their sense of self-preservation. And that's pretty cool, which means it increases their likelihood of being eaten, and therefore the life cycle keeps going. And that's pretty cool. All right, so here we're going to look at malaria, which is also a protozoan, and we're basically just going to have a look at several parts of it. Okay, so here we have just here, these are the protozoa. All right, now the protozoa are the pathogen, and then it gets taken up by the mosquito. Okay, the mosquito is the vector, and then it injects it into a human where it spreads and replicates and becomes much more of a problem, and the human is the host. So agent or pathogen, vector, and human's the host. And then it gets bitten by another mosquito, and spreads it around, the cycle starts all over again. So that's malaria, and that's the vector, which is the mosquito, the pathogen, which is malaria or the protozoan, and the host, which is us. Okay, so that's it, and we'll see you next lecture.